What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about my top 24 Dynasty wide receivers as we head into this 2024 Dynasty offseason. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's talk about my first tier of wide receivers. Now, starting with my S tier wide receivers, there are 3 wide receivers in this category, those being Justin Jefferson, Ja'Marr Chase, and CeeDee Lamb. But starting with my wide receiver 1, it is going to be Justin Jefferson, wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. And since entering the league, Justin Jefferson has done nothing but dominate at the NFL level. 4,800 plus yards in his first 3 seasons is an incredible feat, to say the least. And now there might be some long-term quarterback question marks with the extension of Kirk Cousins looming, but I do think that Justin Jefferson should still remain the dynasty wide receiver 1. And if there is any sort of dip due to his hamstring injury this year where he missed about 7 games, I would be buying this dip by all means necessary. And to me, this is just one of those wide receivers that looks like he is on the path to a gold jacket. So he is my dynasty wide receiver 1. Now, moving on to my second wide receiver in the S tier, it is going to be wide receiver Ja'Marr Chase for the Cincinnati Bengals. And we now have 3 straight wide receiver 1 finishes for Ja'Marr Chase to start off his career, one of which this season was without Joe Burrow for the majority of the year, so that is impressive. Now, Ja'Marr doesn't see the same type of yardage numbers that Justin Jefferson sees, but he is a big play that is always waiting to happen. He does score more touchdowns than Justin Jefferson, and being tied to Joe Burrow long-term is the most likely scenario for Ja'Marr Chase and Joe Burrow for the Cincinnati Bengals offense, so I do think he will be an elite wide receiver 1 for many years to come in this Bengals offense. And now the third player in my S tier is going to be CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. And talk about a breakout campaign in 2023. I think there's a real argument that some people could make for CeeDee Lamb being higher than Ja'Marr Chase, possibly being the dynasty wide receiver 2, especially because it looks like CeeDee Lamb is going to finish as the wide receiver 1 for 2023. And it does seem likely that the Dallas Cowboys are going to extend Dak Prescott and Mike McCarthy most likely this offseason, which is going to be good for CeeDee Lamb. It's going to bring a sense of normalcy, a sense of consistency to him in 2024 and beyond. And I think we might have had a small buy window for CeeDee Lamb going into the 2023 season, but that has all but shut closed. CeeDee Lamb is an S tier wide receiver in my opinion. Now, moving on to my A tier wide receivers, this is going to be a tier of 5 wide receivers that is made up of AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Tyreek Hill. Now, the first wide receiver in this tier is going to be AJ Brown. He is my wide receiver 4, and ever since he teamed up with Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia, AJ Brown has been a top 5 player in target share, and he's averaged about 150 targets per season. Now, part of me feels like he should potentially be considered for that S tier, but ultimately I decided to make him the top of this A tier. Regardless, he is a locked and loaded elite wide receiver 1 for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams, and I do think that he should remain as a top 5 Dynasty wide receiver as long as Jalen Hurts is throwing him the football. Now, the second player in my A tier is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. He comes in as my wide receiver 5, and he continues to show us that the Lions got a steal when they selected him in the 4th round of the 2021 NFL draft. And I love that we've continued to see St. Brown continue to improve at the NFL level. He's improved on his receiving yards and his touchdown numbers every single year at the NFL level. And with a top 5 finish in fantasy points per game here in 2023, it's hard to find many other wide receivers that I would consider as reliable and as beneficial to your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams as Amon-Ra St. Brown has been. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 6, it's going to be Garrett Wilson for the New York Jets, and it's been infuriating watching a player as talented as Garrett Wilson struggle to get any type of consistency at the quarterback position. Zach Wilson, Mike White, Trevor Siemian, Joe Flacco, Tim Boyle, these are all guys that have been throwing the football to Garrett Wilson since he entered the NFL, and despite those guys throwing him the football, he currently leads the NFL in targets. He's 5th in target share, 2nd in air yard share, and 5th in expected fantasy points per game. I think we were truly robbed of a breakout top 5 season from Garrett Wilson here in 2023 with the Aaron Rodgers injury, but I think if Rodgers is healthy and under center in 2024, we should see Garrett Wilson post his first wide receiver 1 season of his career. Now, coming in at wide receiver 7, it's going to be Chris Olave for the New Orleans Saints, and Olave is a silky smooth route runner and an elite deep threat at the NFL level. He's 4th overall in air yard opportunity and 2nd overall in deep targets, so he can always go off at any given week, always a big play away. The unfortunate thing about Chris Olave is we may have to put up with some Derek Carr for another year, but Olave's age and upside do make him a favorite of mine in dynasty leagues moving forward. And now the last wide receiver in my A tier, coming in at wide receiver 8, it's going to be Tyreek Hill for the Miami Dolphins. And in all honesty, Tyreek's on the field play indicates that he should be higher on this list just based off of the production that he's been giving us. However, we are projecting future dynasty value, and Hill's age is getting up there to the point where I do think I have to bump him down a little bit on my board. Hill will be 30 years old heading into the 2024 season. I do think this is a player who still clearly has a lot left in the tank, but if you aren't a contender, this may be a good time to move on from Hill on any of those rosters that you're considering maybe retooling or rebuilding, because his value is going to be very high after what he's shown us this season. Now moving on to my B tier, this is a tier that consists of 5 wide receivers, those wide receivers being Stefon Diggs, Brandon Aiyuk, Devonta Smith, Jaylen, Waddle, and Puka Nacua. And starting with the first wide receiver in this tier, it is going to be my wide receiver 9, Stefon Diggs for the Buffalo Bills. And let me just get this out of the way. Stefon Diggs has not lost it. Now, with that being said, it was a very unglamorous finish to the 2023 season. It's going to leave a lot of sour tastes in the mouths of Dynasty Fantasy Football managers that were relying on Stefon Diggs to help them win a championship, because quite frankly, it just wasn't pretty. Now, with that in mind, there may be a dip in his dynasty value this offseason, and I do think that a competitive team would be smart to buy the dip on Stefon Diggs. Just like Tyreek Hill, the age is getting up to the point where I do have to drop him down in my dynasty rankings, but he has been a top 12 fantasy football wide receiver in points per game every single season that he's been in Buffalo, and I still think that he has a couple more seasons left being a big contributor for your dynasty fantasy football teams. Now moving on to my wide receiver 10, that is going to be Brandon Aiyuk for the San Francisco 49ers, and Brandon Aiyuk has continued to develop into a great NFL wide receiver. I do believe that he has surpassed Deebo Samuel as the #1 wide receiver here in San Francisco, and he is on pace to have his second season in a row with 100 plus targets. For those that were doubting Brock Purdy, he has proven to be legit, and Aiyuk does seem to be a favorite of Purdy in this offense. Aiyuk's been incredibly efficient as a wide receiver. He ranks #2 overall in yards per route run, and he's currently 8th overall in receiving yards in 2023. I think Aiyuk is a low-end wide receiver 1, a high-end wide receiver 2, depending on the matchup any given week, and definitely a guy that I like on my Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. Now moving over to my wide receiver 11, that is going to be Devonta Smith for the Philadelphia Eagles. And Devonta, unfortunately, is having to play a little bit of Robin in this Eagles offense. It's unfortunate because Smith is truly a special wide receiver. The issue with Smith long-term is, will he ever get the opportunity to pass A.J. Brown as the #1 option? My guess is probably not. However, that doesn't mean that Devonta is going to be bad for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. Hurts has proven that he can feed both of these guys enough to keep Devonta somewhere around that high-end wide receiver 2 range. And Smith possesses the ability to win you a week here and there, but Smith may just be a little bit more inconsistent than you want out of a guy that's probably being valued as a wide receiver 1 by most people in your Dynasty leagues. Now moving on to my wide receiver 12, that is going to be Jaylen Waddle for the Miami Dolphins. And Jaylen Waddle is also playing second fiddle, just like I said with Devonta Smith, except he's playing it to Tyreek Hill, which obviously is going to cap his upside. Now Waddle had a little bit of a down year in 2023 compared to his previous 2. Maybe that's just because Tyreek Hill was chasing 2,000 yards, maybe not, but Waddle dropped from a top 15 fantasy football wide receiver in points per game in 2021 and 2022 to wide receiver 22 in fantasy points per game in 2023. So for now, I'm just going to chalk this up as a bad year, probably because the receiving touchdowns and the yardages took a little bit of a hit. But if he does this in 2024, we may be having to move Jaylen Waddle down a tier. And now the final player in my B tier, coming in at wide receiver 13, it's going to be Puka Nacua, who is everybody's favorite waiver wire pickup from this offseason, and the player who had the best rookie season of all the 2023 wide receivers. Puka, to me, was very, very hard to rank. There's a couple variables that played a role in that, but ultimately he did land in my B tier. Now, I think there's a real argument that you could put Puka over every single player that I've already listed in this B tier, and I really wouldn't blame you if you wanted to make that argument. He posted top 10 numbers in targets, target share, receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points per game in 2023. So Puka Nacua has really been that guy for your fantasy football teams. And I think really we could be looking at potentially the next Amon-Ra St. Brown type of wide receiver. I think the thing that worries me the most is Stafford's future. It is somewhat concerning, but year 2 is going to be a huge teller as to what Puka Nacua can be long-term for your Dynasty Fantasy Football team. Now moving on to my C tier of wide receivers, this tier consists of 5 wide receivers. Those wide receivers being Drake London, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman Jr., T. Higgins, and DK Metcalf. And And starting off this tier with my wide receiver 14, it is going to be Drake London. And this is another young wide receiver who has been cursed by horrible quarterback play to start his career. London has been a fantastic separator, especially underneath versus man coverage at the NFL level. And if Atlanta can figure out their quarterback situation and hopefully get rid of Arthur Smith this offseason, I do think that London will be set up to explode here in 2024. However, as it is set up, there are a lot of variables that are going to be out of Drake London's control that will need to take place for him to break out, but the upside is undeniably high for Drake London as a wide receiver at the NFL level. Now moving on to my wide receiver 15, that is going to be DJ Moore for the Chicago Bears, and DJ Moore goes to the Chicago Bears this offseason as part of that notorious Bryce Young deal, and in return he posts the best fantasy football season of his career so far with over 1,100 receiving yards and 16.4 fantasy points per game in 2023. Moore gave those patient enough to see him become a wide receiver one, the season that they've all been dreaming of. Now, I do think there are a few questions about the future of the Bears heading into 2024, like who will be the quarterback? Is it going to be Justin Fields? Is it going to be Caleb Williams? Now, while I don't think either of those is going to be a negative thing for DJ Moore, I do think we need to consider that if they stick with Justin Fields, will they be in position to draft Marvin Harrison Jr.? And if they do, how will that affect DJ Moore in the future? Now, coming in at wide receiver 16, that is going to be Michael Pittman Jr. for the Indianapolis Colts. And Pittman is probably one of the most underrated wide receivers in the NFL by far. He's being used like an alpha. He performs like an alpha, but he's never really being valued as an alpha for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. I can't really make it make sense, but Pittman has posted a career best of 16.7 fantasy points per game in 2023. He was top 10 in targets, target share, red zone targets, receptions, yards after the catch. I think the only question mark with Michael Pittman moving forward is, will Indianapolis give him the contract extension that I think he's earned? And if so, was that slow start that he had in 2023 because of Anthony Richardson, or was that merely a coincidence? Now moving on to my wide receiver 17, that is going to be T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, and he's coming off of an injury-riddled 2023 season. I think we can all agree that T. Higgins' dynasty stock has taken a negative hit over the last couple months. However, I do think he is still one of the best number twos in the NFL. Just like some of these other guys, there are question marks about his future. The main one being, is he going to stay in Cincinnati, or is he going to become an unrestricted free agent this offseason and be able to test the market? I think it's going to be interesting to see how that is addressed this offseason, but if I did have to make a bet today, I would bet that T. Higgins is going to be playing in a different uniform in 2024. I don't expect him to be back in Cincinnati, and because of that, it's hard to project much more at this moment. Now, the last wide receiver in this C tier, coming in at wide receiver 18, it is going to be DK Metcalf for the Seattle Seahawks, and Metcalf posted similar numbers this year to his 2019 rookie season, which obviously isn't ideal for anybody who rostered DK Metcalf this year. Now, I do think it's pretty obvious at this point that Geno Smith's 2022 magic was an outlier year, and he's probably not going to be the answer at the quarterback position for Seattle long term. But despite this being DK's second worst fantasy football season of his career, he was still a low-end wide receiver 2 from a fantasy points per game standpoint. I do think it's pretty safe to call Metcalf a safe wide receiver 2 with upside. But with that being said, as long as Geno is the quarterback, I do think he is going to lack the upside that many have used to argue him as a wide receiver 1. Now moving on to my D tier, this is a tier that consists of 4 wide receivers, those wide receivers being Jaxon, Smith-Njigba, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and Tank Dell. And starting with the first wide receiver in this tier, coming in at wide receiver 19, that is going to be Jaxon Smith-Njigba, and JSN's rookie year has been everything that I expected it to be coming into the NFL. He did come into a wide receiver room with DK and Tyler Lockett that we knew he would have to earn his reps at the NFL level if he wanted to take over that wide receiver 2 job. Now, I do think that as the season has come to a close, JSN has taken over the wide receiver 2 from Tyler Lockett. And like I said with DK, I don't love Geno Smith as the quarterback long term, but JSN does have that type of game where we could see him remain as a safe floor option while Geno finishes his time in Seattle. And JSN's year 2 is going to be crucial to deciphering what type of upside he can possess as a dynasty asset. But this is a wide receiver that if there is a dip in his value from last year, I would be buying it anywhere I can get it in my dynasty leagues this offseason. Now moving on to my wide receiver 20, that is going to be Zay Flowers for the Baltimore Ravens. And Zay Flowers was set up for success coming into 2023. Many people's wide receiver 2 coming into the class, and Flowers was given an empty wide receiver room in the second half of the season after Mark Andrews went down with an ankle injury. Now with that new opportunity, Zay did go on to have multiple top 12 finishes at the position in Andrews' absence, which which was something he wasn't able to do with Mark Andrews on the field. I think Zay looks to be a great pro-level wide receiver, but my only question with him is he going to get the opportunities that he was getting in the second half of this season when Mark Andrews is healthy and back in the lineup in 2024? Now, coming in at my wide receiver 21, that's going to be Jordan Addison for the Minnesota Vikings. And keeping this rookie wide receiver train rolling, Jordan Addison also had similar opportunities as Zay when Justin Jefferson went down for a 7-week stretch in the middle of the season. Now, unfortunately for Addison, he would also lose his starting quarterback Kirk Cousins shortly after, but in the 2.5 weeks that he was able to play with Kirk Cousins as the wide receiver 1 of this Minnesota Vikings squad, he finished as the wide receiver 13 on one of those weeks, and he also finished as the wide receiver 1 on the week in one of those weeks as well. Now, I think it's pretty clear that Addison has the talent to succeed at the NFL level and has the talent to succeed for your fantasy football teams. However, I do think that this talent is going to be capped as long as Justin Jefferson is playing opposite him, and I do expect the Minnesota Vikings to re-sign Justin Jefferson this offseason to a long-term contract extension. But even if that happens, Jordan Addison should be a high upside wide receiver 2 for your fantasy football teams. And now moving on to the final wide receiver in this tier, it is going to be my wide receiver 22. That is going to be Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. And Tank Dell had a major breakout thanks to hopeful rookie of the year CJ Stroud. Now, the rumor in the draft cycle was that CJ Stroud asked the Houston Texans to make sure that they went and got Tank Dell for him, and that looks like it was a good choice for all parties involved. Now, Dell did suffer a fractured fibula this year, and he was placed on season-ending IR in week 13, but before that, Tank Dell was getting hot for your fantasy football teams. I think Houston has two very good wide receivers in Tank Dell and Nico Collins, but Dell would be my choice of these two, and I do love this pairing of Tank Dell and CJ Stroud for the remainder of their rookie contracts. And now moving on to my final tier of this video, it is going to be my E tier, and the two wide receivers rounding out the top 24 in this tier are going to be Deebo Samuel and Nico Collins. So starting with my wide receiver 23, that is going to be Deebo Samuel for the San Francisco 49ers, and Deebo Samuel has bounced back in 2023 after having a down 2022 season, and his utilization is unlike any player in football at this point. This is a player that is 3rd overall in total touchdowns and 10th overall in fantasy points per game, but somehow only has 53 receptions and 834 receiving yards as a wide receiver on the San Francisco 49ers offense. Now, Deebo is one of those players that is very hard for me to rank as well, but with a play style that's a little bit more aggressive than the normal wide receiver, going into his age 28 season, I do think more points are going to be on the horizon for Deebo, but he does seem like he is pretty risky, and he's a guy that we need to keep in mind has a cap hit that is going to jump from $8 million to $28 million this offseason, and he has guys like CMC and Brandon Aiyuk who are also due sizable raises as well, so it's going to be interesting to see how the San Francisco 49ers navigate this spike in cap hits from multiple key pieces on this team. Now, coming in as the last wide receiver, this is going to be my wide receiver 24. That is Nico Collins for the Houston Texans, and Nico Collins was a favorite sleeper of mine for many years, really didn't come to fruition, but just like I mentioned with Tank Dell, thanks to CJ Stroud coming into the building, Nico Collins finally broke out in 2023. He averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game, which was good for wide receiver 14 this year. Now, assuming nothing changes in this wide receiver room, I do think that Nico Collins is set up for a great 2024 season. It is worth noting that Nico is going to be headed into his last year of his rookie deal in 2024, so he is going to be playing for that contract extension in Houston, but I also think it's not out of the realm of possibilities to see Houston target a free agent wide receiver this offseason or a rookie wide receiver in the draft, just so they can add another receiving weapon to this offense in case Nico Collins walks next year. I think this offseason is going to be very telling on how Houston actually views their current wide receiver room, but based on this last year's performance and his age, Nico Collins sneaks into my top 24 wide receivers. Now, that is all I have for you guys today. If you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support, and it does let me know that you guys are truly enjoying the content that we are pushing out each and every week. Additionally, make sure you guys are subscribed to this YouTube channel and make sure you hit that notification bell. That way you never miss one of our videos when they do come out. And last but not least, make sure you guys join that free Discord. That Discord is going to be linked in the description. We talk fantasy football in there 24/7, 365, helping you guys out with any of your fantasy football needs. So make sure you go join that Discord. Like I said, it is free to join, so there's no risk in doing that. So with all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.